It's here. It's finally here. The brand spanking new DaveMossTuning.com. All of Dave's videos and articles in one convenient location. Click the link below and enjoy.
What type of spring do I have? Well, on bikes like this with a twin or single shock, sometimes you can see the shape of the spring itself. So let's take a look at what we have. The bottom of this spring is extremely narrow. The top of the spring is significantly wider. The end or the top of the spring itself, the coils want to touch each other, and then the gaps change in between and tighten up. So the spring is conical in shape and the winds also touch each other. So that makes this spring extremely progressive. What does progressive mean? Soft. It'll go through the stroke and it will move and it'll give you a lot of comfort. This type of motorcycle was never meant for comfort in terms of super soft. So what manufacturers try to do with a progressive spring is give you the best of all worlds, and that means that you're working in the middle 2/3 of travel at all times, which is why they also give you a ramp adjuster to select the tension on the spring. So very progressive type spring on this bike. So on the DFL we have another example of a progressive spring. 3 winds are very close to each other. The spring is probably very close in circumference end to end, but these 3 winds, when I push on the shock, are going to close up and touch each other, and then as we come through the winds, the gap in each one gets bigger until we get to the bottom. So very slightly conical, a lot more springs touching each other at the top. The spring wire is a lot thicker on this bike because it's supporting a lot more weight and power, so that makes sense. So let's move the shock to show you where the movement occurs. And with very little energy and effort, I can put the shock through a lot of movement. And you can see those 3 springs touch each other. What does that mean when we ride the bike? Well, when you have a progressive spring, it offers tension. And as the spring collapses or expands, that tension, that rate of the spring changes. So as you compress it, it's soft initially and then it firms itself up because these winds touch each other, which makes the spring stiffer. So the spring is trying to cope with a range of rider, a range of road conditions, and then of course torque and power from an engine. So the deeper you go in the stroke, the firmer the spring is in terms of its rate. So depending on what you have, how you ride, what your weight is, we can see the shock shaft. What's dirty, what's clean. Is the progressive spring right for you? And then if you have to go in and adjust it with the lock rings, then it's going to stiffen the spring up through a certain part of the stroke. Because it's a progressive spring, it won't stiffen the whole spring. And that's the one thing to remember in the difference with linear and progressive. Adding preload is great, but realistically, does it stop it bottoming out or using as much travel as you did before? Based on the way you ride and that spring, you're gonna have to figure it out by seeing what's dirty and what's clean on the shock shaft. Now on a scrambler, when we look at this spring, the gap in the winds is the same all the way down. So the shape in terms of diameter at the top and the bottom is the same. So this could be, without measuring it, they could have a logical assumption here that this is a straight rate spring. Now with aftermarket suspension, generally you're gonna get straight rate springs, forks and shocks. So then that brings into question, what's the sag, where are you, what are the numbers, is the spring too soft or too stiff for you? And the difference with a linear spring is that no matter how much you compress it, the stored energy in that spring is the same. That's why it's labeled as linear. So if we add preload, it's only going to rebound at a certain rate, simply because the rate of the spring doesn't change when it's compressed and released. So with a linear spring, once you set rebound for that spring for a little while, and we'll go into why with oil and viscosity and age, that setting can stay there if you adjust your preload up and down to get your travel and the amount you use set correctly. On a progressive spring, if you change the preload, and you change it significantly by a couple turns or more, you have to reset the rebound, because the stored energy is going to be different in the way that that shock rides. So linear springs, generally once you set the tension, you can set the rebound. If you change the tension, you shouldn't have to change the rebound. The caveat there is oil and oil age. We have to service forks and shock. We service them quicker than we used to, because with the viscosity of oil cold to hot, we don't want a variance. So if you're changing fork oil every 6,000 and you're changing shock oil about the same for a road bike, you're going to adjust your rebound, because as that oil ages, even with linear springs, when the oil gets hot and it gets older, it gets thinner. So you don't chase rebounds, you just adjust the settings accordingly. So with compression damping as well on hydraulics, as the oil ages, you've got to change that too. Whether you have linear or progressive doesn't matter.
To schedule a remote tuning appointment for you and your bike with Dave via text, email, Facebook, etc., contact Dave on Facebook or by email, dave@davemosstuning.com.